Okay, so you guys can see the screen. Hopefully
Yep.
that's visible in the recording. I would imagine it is. Okay, so let us start. I've got conversations there. You can stop and ask questions at any time. Otherwise, I'm just going to go. Okay, so 1896, the Tsar is in charge. What number Tsar is he? Tsar Nicholas II, and coronated in 1896. And he has been given his power by God. All law comes from him. All Russian officials must swear an oath to him personally, not to Russia, showing how important the Tsar is. And if we remember, Russia as well is massive. So it's very, not only is it big physically, but that means that it's a geographically and culturally and linguistically diverse country. People living in St. Petersburg are going to have a very different experience to people living in Vladivostok. And so because of that, a ruler over here is not going to properly understand the lives and problems of all Russian people. Russian society is built on these pillars. The pillars are, we remember, autocratic government. So a Russian government is one where one person is in charge. Nobility is important. The law is very strict. The army, the Okhrana, and the church, all of these things work in tandem to help the Tsar control his people and to support an autocratic government. And then Russian society, as we remember, is based on privilege of birth, not by how much you work or what you earn. And 82% of the population in 1897 were peasants. So the majority of your country are peasants, but these people are not well supported by government. Instead, the government supports the ruling class and the upper class more, despite them making up only 12.5% of the population. Okay. And basically, because of this land and the massive number of peasants, or despite this, Russia is really behind compared to other countries. They lack a lot of infrastructure and ability to manufacture things. That is until Sergei Witta comes along, and he wants to improve the strength of the military and the country's reputation through modernization, that's in capitals, and industrialization. Does anyone remember what steps he takes to do that? Any of the steps? How does he improve the military strength, reputation, and help industrialization? Think about our friend Thomas, the tank engine. I gave that away. Sorry. Basically, he took 3 steps. He sought advice from modernized countries. He attracted foreign capital, so he got investments from people from different countries as well as other countries themselves to invest in Russia. And he expanded the railway system. And expanding the railway system was probably the best thing he did because it allowed for goods and services to travel more easily throughout Russia and helped people get access to food as well, whilst also creating jobs. And I'll actually go down here. He was actually quite successful, and there was significant growth between 1890 and 1900. For instance, the production of iron and steel rose from 9 to 76 million poods a year. The railway trackage in the country doubled. In those 10 years, the coal output tripled, and Moscow was the fastest growing city, apart from New York, in the world. People, mainly these peasants who lived out here, were flocking to Moscow and other cities with the hopes of work. And so historians view him in 2 different ways, Witta and his reforms. So some people view him favorably, arguing that he dramatically improved industry, he attracted foreign investment into the country. These were good things. However, others were critical of Witta's reforms, arguing that it made Russia too dependent on foreign investment, and they were only focusing on industry instead of agriculture, when such a huge population, percentage of their population were in agriculture. And I'm actually wondering now, if had Witter done more to focus on agriculture now, would the famine of 1921 have been as significant? Who knows? So at the same time, Witter is trying to improve the country economically, Russia enters into the Russo-Japanese War with Japan. And this was driven by imperialism. Both Russia and Japan were trying to essentially colonize a part of China. But it was not a good battle for Russia to be in. It proved that they were an inferior army, that their lack of industrialization was severely harming them. Japan was a tiny country with a small army, but they were not a small army, but they had a stronger army, and they were able to humiliate the Russians. Notably at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, in which of the 45 Russian warships that existed, 35 were sunk. And that's of all the warships they had. They only had 45. After this day, they had 10. And 10,000 Russian sailors were killed or captured. And this was humiliating, which kind of sparked some of the first seeds of revolutionary uprising in Russia. People were like, well, how is our government okay with joining wars that we're going to lose? It was also humiliating because they needed America's assistance in signing a treaty to end the war with Japan. And this PowerPoint will be available as well, so if you need the quotes, you can get them. So Frank Jacob was a historian, and he kind of talked a lot about this battle and said that the image of Russia would change because of this, and the war really hurt Russia's reputation, both within Russia and globally. And their failure was because the Russians underestimated Japan, their soldiers were slow to mobilize, and the Tsar said he would fight no matter how many people died, no matter how long the war lasted. And this really alienated a lot of the Russian people, and is an early clue to the Tsar's inability to lead a country, especially through war. So if you had a question about the role of the Tsar in prolonging or war or sparking discontent, this would be a great early example to talk about how the Tsar was willing to fight in the Russo-Japanese War for as long as it took, despite as many deaths, and ultimately lost, which really alienated a lot of his supporters. And that is basically going to lead us up to Bloody Sunday. So the main things that have happened in Russia so far, Witter has done economic reforms, and they fought in the Russo-Japanese War. Both of these things combined mean that there's some tension brewing, especially amongst the poor. And so as a result of Witter's reforms, because they increased so dramatically, because industry has boomed, essentially, this has led to a number of social and political and economic problems. Socially, the rise of people working in factories means that there's also been a rise in poor working conditions. Examples were that people are working 12-hour days or 60 working hour weeks. They were using unsafe equipment, so a lot of people were dying. Children and women were working underground and in unsafe environments, and people were being fined arbitrarily. So if you were a factory worker and you were caught singing, or your boss thought you looked dirty, you would be given a fine that would come out of your salary. In addition, there was insufficient housing, and this is a good statistic to remember, that we have an average of 16 people per apartment and 6 people per room. Hello, Olivia. This is being recorded, so if you missed the beginning, that's okay. And you can duck out at any time if you need to. Then, leading to Bloody Sunday, we also had some political problems. And this, remember when I spoke about how all of these people, all of these farmers have moved to Moscow? It's the fastest growing city. this is part of the reason that there's really poor housing and poor working conditions. But it also means, so that's part of why people are so upset. We also have more people in an area, which means that revolutionary sentiment can spread. Witter also wanted educated workers, and that meant that people now had more education, which meant they were more willing and able to challenge the government. And we've got a growing middle class, and the middle class are typically those who revolt because they have, again, the education and ability to do so. And here's this famous quote. When I read this quote, I was like, I remember those days back when we would laugh about Corona and think we would miss like a week of school. I remember reading this quote, which was, Witter hoped and believed that industrialization would transform Russian society, but to become industrialized, Russia had first to be transformed. So if we remember, yes, Witter's done all of this work to try and make Russia a more industrialized place, but that's led to all of these problems, like the social and political ones I've just mentioned. In order to fix these, they need industrialization, but they can't get proper industrialization until they've solved these problems. Excuse me. And that quote is by Roger. That's a good one to use. I'm about to cough, sorry. And the metaphor that we use for this quote, if we remember, is you can't get a job without experience, can't get experience without a job. Okay, and that leads us to Bloody Sunday. So the long-term causes of Bloody Sunday were famine, recession in the 1890s, and this rapid migration to cities, which increases the shortage of food and housing. Short-term, the war loss has had quite an economic impact. They've lost a lot of money fighting the war, and so there's less money to support citizens. And then the catalyst was that some steel workers at the Pulatov steel factory, or at a steel factory, sorry, they were fired, and that led to citywide strikes. So I think it was 6 workers were fired for a seemingly arbitrary reason. That steel work then went on strike, and then other people around the city in other steelworks started to strike, and then people of all businesses began to strike. And that led for our man, Father Gapon. So you remember he was a deeply religious leader. He was very powerful, and he wrote a petition. No, it wasn't known then as the Bloody Sunday petition, but is now. And he led hundreds of workers and women in protest of the working conditions in Russia at the time. And their petition was respectful and traditional. They spoke highly of the Tsar. They said, we have no strength left. They said, give orders and swear that they shall be fulfilled, and you'll make Russia happy and glorious. So they basically said to the Tsar, we love you. All we want is for you to give us some better working conditions, and then you're going to make Russia so happy and so powerful. And if we remember from depictions of the protests, they were carrying photos of the Tsar and the Tsarina, and were really worshipping him as they walked towards the Winter Palace. However, the government claimed that the petition was rude, and that's a direct quote, and the Tsar himself was not calm in this situation. Now, it's unclear to historians whether the Tsar himself ordered the Okhrana on their horses to go and attack the protesters, but it did happen. There was a slaughter, and I can't believe I didn't put the number of deaths in here. Does anyone remember it just before I look it up? Deaths, Bloody Sunday. There's been so many Bloody Sundays. 96 dead and 333 injured, according to the Tsar. However, anti-government sources say that 4,000 were died, and today we say maybe 1,000. And I'll add this to the PowerPoint. That's not a PowerPoint. Yeah, Maisie, it was unconfirmed. So all of these are estimates. The officials saying 100, then other people are 4,000. So it's thought to be 1,000. It's an estimate. I don't know if it comes up in the chat, but Macy asked if it was unconfirmed, and yes, it is. Or were you saying that it was unconfirmed that the Tsar ordered it? Because that's unconfirmed. Either way, so we've got Alan Wood, and here's a nice quote by him, that this Bloody Sunday massacre caused great anger amongst all people throughout Russia. So not just the industrial workers who were originally protesting, but middle class, intellectuals, the whole of Russian society was aroused to fury. The Tsar typically did nothing. So I know this is a historian, Alan Wood, but what a damning criticism of the Tsar, that as always, he has done nothing to support his people despite these mass protests. And here, this is from Alpha History, just their 5 key points about Bloody Sunday. Something that I recommend to do for revision is check the Alpha History for the study design dot points, because at the bottom of their pages, they usually summarize it quite quickly. So we'll just quickly read through this. So Bloody Sunday began as a protest by industrial workers because of low wages, poor conditions, and bad treatment from their employers. These conditions were worsened due to the Russo-Japanese War and a recession that came as a result of the war, which led to the formation of workers' sections, which was essentially groups of workers who would share information and plan strikes and protests. In January 1905, workers at the Pulatov Steelworks drafted a petition intended for the Tsar. When they marched on the Winter Palace to deliver this petition, many were shot by Tsarist soldiers. Then Bloody Sunday, as it became known, eroded respect for Tsarism and contributed to a wave of general strikes. And do we remember, so I said they were carrying these pictures of the Tsar and the Tsarina, but what did the Tsar's nickname turn to after Bloody Sunday? Instead of Tsar Nicholas, the Little Father, he was now known just, yes, as Nicholas the Bloody. And that's just a perfect piece of evidence to throw in, that as a result of Bloody Sunday, our little father, Tsar Nicholas, instead became known as Nicholas the Bloody. Yeah, good, Eva, and hello. This whole thing is being recorded, so don't worry about coming in late. And you can leave whenever. So we finally have sort of, don't apologize, revolution approaching. And this happened at the beginning of the year. Why is it in January? So 1905 is going to be sort of one of our big war years. Sorry, revolution years. Revolution. And there were a series of revolutionary crises in this year. And a big criticism that comes of Tsar Nicholas at this time, and maybe I'll make a separate video just going through of all of Tsar Nicholas's flaws. I think I'll do that. It'll be short, but I think it'll be a nice way to lay them all down. Was that Nicholas was motivated by, throughout this year, his goal was to save his regime, to save Tsarism, instead of actually reforming Russia and making a better place for all. And so there were a number of crises, there were strikes, there were protests throughout the year. And ultimately, Tsar Nicholas, in an attempt to end these, wrote and signed the October Manifesto, which was published in the 17th of October, 1905. And this was to put an end to the strikes and protests that had been happening. And the main thing that it promised was the establishment of a fairly elected Duma, or a government. If we remember, the October Manifesto was sort of seen as a band-aid measure to stop the 1905 Russian Revolution, with the hope that it would save his regime and nothing would happen again. This was in the October Manifesto. It said the way to avoid a revolution would be to give people the civil rights, freedom of speech and press, and to have all laws confirmed by the Duma. So these were the promises that were given. However, some people saw right through this. So Trotsky said that the October Manifesto, and this is our perfect quote, was only a scrap of paper, that it was worth nothing. And then this is a really good quote by Trotsky as well. Freedom of assembly is granted, but the assemblies are surrounded by military. Freedom of speech is granted, but censorship still exists. Freedom of knowledge is granted, but universities are full of troops. A constitution is given, but the autocracy remains. Everything is given and nothing is given. So Trotsky was so critical of the October Manifesto, and it turns out that he was correct. I like this one too. R.I.P. to this man from Lazy Town. But when you see the October Manifesto, when you sign it, but then immediately go back on it. I don't know why I left all of these in here. But and that's actually the end of that PowerPoint. So that takes us to 1906. So we had some crises in 1905. I probably should have gone through that more. I'll make a PDF of what they actually were. But we had a number of protests throughout 1905 following the Bloody Sunday Massacre. So the 1905 revolution's cause was the Bloody Sunday Massacre. It led to the revolution itself looked like protests and strikes. It ended when the Tsar signed the October Manifesto, which promised more rights and a Duma. Okay. But then the Dumas, we know, were not successful. And we have this little chart filled out. I thought we'd quickly have a go at doing it now. Does anyone remember what the fundamental state laws were? So the fundamental state laws, a document outlining new laws from the Tsar, reminding the people of Russia that, are there any guesses? It's okay. I kind of feel like this must be what Dora the Explorer feels like when she keeps asking the people for help, but she can't hear them. But I know you're saying it at home. So the fundamental state laws basically was a document that said, despite anything, the Tsar remains the ultimate ruler of Russia, and that is because God has given him this power. It said that the Tsar is the highest authority. Which basically meant that as the Dumas in 1906 were about to begin, the Tsar has already said that they're not going to be effective because no matter what decisions they make, he can overrule them. And then we have the first and second Dumas, which are dismissed because they are essentially too radical. And the first one barely lasts any time at all. These are dismissed really quickly because it becomes clear that the Tsar is not interested in meaningful political representation for the people. And this is proven when, after the second Duma is dismissed, he implements electoral law changes which limit the requirements for people to vote. So now, significantly less white men are allowed to vote. Pretty much voting is exclusive for the rich. So the third and fourth Dumas, they're able to last their entire term, but they only represent the rich and they have no lasting impact. just to refresh, the October Manifesto, which the Tsar signed to end the 1905 revolution, was deeply unsuccessful because it promised the establishment of Dumas, but the Tsar, as soon as he can, worked to diminish the power of these Dumas. First, by passing the fundamental state laws, which reminded Russia that he held the highest authority in the country. Secondly, when the Dumas appeared to become too radical, he would dismiss them. Thirdly, he changed electoral laws, limiting the ability of the poor to vote. And finally, while the third and fourth Dumas were technically successful in that they were not dismissed or closed early, they only represented a select group of people and had no lasting impact. And here we have a quote. So the year of the 1905 revolution showed the astonishing resilience of the regime. It could gain ground on every front, face the bitter opposition of almost all the articulate strata of society. So they could face, that's fine, Jess, bye. They could face, just before I keep reading this, it's only Olivia and Eva. You guys can leave at any point if you need to. This recording will be up. Yes, Eva has asked if the fourth Dumas she said that they were the most conservative and they repressed strikes, and that's correct. Okay. Basically, the Dumas could do anything and still survive. Sorry, the Tsar could face anything and still survive. And then they end this quote, but with it, they didn't only survive, but they also could attack. Okay. And now, speaking, Eva, about repression, do we remember this hunky-dory man, Peter Stolypin? So Stolypin is the guy who replaced Witte. Witte was kind of forced out. He resigned, but there were all of these rumors about him, and he basically had no option to resign. And Peter Stolypin was chosen as the natural successor. He was a realist, but he also still supported the Tsar. And his goal in life was to strengthen the position of the Tsar in Russia. And this is a quote for him. As the revolution is so strong, I must carry through effective measures of reform, and at the same time, I must face revolution, resist it, and stop it. His main task that he thought would help to support the Tsar was to increase the size of peasant land to create a wealthy class of landowning peasants. And here are his reforms. So some were about land, some were social reforms, and there were some industrial reforms. I'm not sure if we remember, but we drew little pictures about these. So he said that land would be available for the peasants. He created a credit system so peasants can buy land and equipment. Socially, he tried to bring in proportional taxation, which meant that peasants weren't having to pay unfair taxes. He introduced compulsory primary education, religious tolerance, and then his industrial revolutions included improvements to the working day. The maximum working day was shortened, and women and children are no longer allowed to work at night. So those all sound great, and they were. But he was also doing a lot of repression. So if we notice here, this is the number of executions, and they dramatically increase in 1906 when Peter Stolypin gets into power, from 19 executions in 1905. And remember, 1905 is a year of revolution, so that they only had 19 executions in a year of revolution, but the following year had 236, shows how Peter Stolypin was really using executions to scare and repress revolutionaries. And they reached a peak in 1908 with 1,330. Yes, there was a massive massacre, but he wasn't in power. We're going to talk about the massacre, I think, in 2 slides, Eva. The numbers start to drop at 1911. Does anyone remember why they dropped? what happened in 1911. That's okay. Stolypin was assassinated in 1911, and that's what led to the drops. Then in 1912, there was the Leonard Goldfields massacre. So Peter Stolypin was able to silence revolutionary parties, ideologies, and movements. Repression plus the growing economy lessened revolutionary action. Things were pretty quiet from 1906 until 1911 because of Peter Stolypin, because he was out there quieting revolutionaries through death, and the economy was growing and flourishing. However, in 1911, he was assassinated, and then 1912 revolution starts to spark again following the Leonard Goldfields massacre. In this year, Lenin also starts a newspaper and gets a girlfriend, and that is significant because his girlfriend is a French revolutionary, and so she sort of inspires him, and then Lenin in his newspaper, the Pravda, is able to communicate his ideological thoughts. So, oh, my battery is running low. I'm just going to quickly turn my camera off while I get my charger. Sorry, everyone. I should cut this out of the recording, but I won't. Okay. Let's keep going. So this is the Leonard Goldfields massacre that we're going to talk about now. And the massacre itself was a shooting of goldfield miners who were on strike. The purpose of the strike was basically in these gold fields in Lena, there were really harsh working conditions and bad food that led to the strike. So, for example, for every 1,000 workers at this massacre, there were 700 accidents, and there were thousands of workers. They worked for 15 to 16 hours a day. Their salary would be taken for fines, and the final straw, the catalyst for the strike, was when they were fed rotten meat, which essentially meant that they were not getting fed, they were having their money taken, and many of them were being killed or really badly injured. So they're on strike, and the government sends in troops to arrest the strikers. They start shooting at them, and hundreds are killed and wounded, as we can see here. And this was a turning point in Russian society. We've had this period of peace because of Stolypin's reforms, but now we've entered a turning point where revolutionary sentiment has been reignited. The significance of the Leonard Goldfields massacres was that it proved the government was willing to use violence. It ended Stolypin's peace stage, reignited revolutionary sentiment, and it led to a rise in economic and political strikes. For example, in April, there were 700 political strikes as a result of the massacre, which happened on the 4th of April. On May the 1st, there were over 1,000 strikes in Russia commemorating the Leonard Goldfields massacre. And if we have a look at this statistic, in 1905, so that was that revolution year, there were 14,000 strikes. There were just 200 in 1910. In 1911, it increased to 466, and by 1912, the year of this massacre, there were 1,918 strikes. Lenin himself argued that the massacre inflamed the masses with a revolutionary fire. And so we've got all of this tension in Russia, and that's when the big thing happens, World War I. Serbia is being threatened by Austria-Hungary and request assistance from the Russian Empire. The very next day, Tsar Nicholas orders mobilization, so he sends in the troops. And once that was done, it could not be rescinded, it could not be taken back. And here's our great A.J.P. Taylor quote, "Once started, the wagons must roll forward and inevitably towards their goal." And as we know from the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians are not equipped to deal with war. This is not going to go well for them. And people warned the Tsar that this would not go well for them. This man, Minister Peter de Novo, we remember Novo shoes, I think was our little memory device. He said that because of entering the war, they're going to be flung into anarchy. There's going to be trouble for farmers. There's going to be trouble paying soldiers, labor problems because people are going to be fighting the war, etc. And then he ended by saying, if we go with this war, social revolution in its most extreme form is inevitable. And he was correct. I can't remember what de novo looked like. Let's have a look. Oh, that's funny. He looked smart. I would trust him. Tsar Nicholas should have listened harder. Okay. We're almost there for today. Well done for sticking with us. So, initially, the Russians were patriotic. They were like, yes, let's show people how it's done. And so, at the beginning of the war, Nicholas had a lot of support. And workers' strikes even halted in 1914 as people focused more on supporting the war effort. The Duma even dissolved so that it didn't interfere with Russia in the war, which you would think that this would be the perfect time to have a Duma, but that just shows how autocratic the society was, with just the Tsar was meant to make all of the decisions. Government even changed the name of the capital from St. Petersburg to Petrograd in an attempt to sound more Russian. Lenin was critical of the war. He thought it was the bourgeois upper class just exploiting lower class for their gain. And he basically appealed to the Russians for a social revolution, but he did not get much support. And again, this is because Russians were mostly supportive of the war, or Russia being in the war. This is going to change as Russia starts losing. Despite having the largest army in the world, Russia had one of the worst armies in the world. They had poor military leadership. They had very little ammunition, supplies, and organization. The train system that Vida had been working to build was broken in a lot of places. There were tracks missing in a lot of places, which meant the troops didn't have access to food. And also another problem was the people who were meant to be fixing the trains, working on the trains, fixing the tracks, were also fighting the war. So it couldn't be fixed. If we remember, as the war goes on, we have a ratio of prisoners of war to dead soldiers, where for every soldier that was killed, every Russian soldier that was killed, 16 were taken as prisoners of war. Now, in war, a lot of soldiers would say that they would rather die for their country than be taken as a prisoner of war. So the fact that these numbers were so high, and this is really unusually high, it showed that the soldiers would rather be captured than die for their country. So the soldiers, they had more than Germany and Austria-Hungary combined, but they were mainly all peasants without any training. And so Tsar Nicholas began, as the Russians begin to lose at war, as people's friends and family are dying, the army is turning against the Tsar, and the country itself is turning against the Tsar. So the army is failing because they have poor ammunition. Remember the stories of one soldier, all the soldiers would go in a line. One soldier would attack, then they would be shot and die. The person behind them in the line would take their gun and use that, and so on and so forth. So soldiers were taking their guns from their dead peers and enemies. They were really badly organized inside the army. They were demoralized, like we saw a lot of them are preferring to be prisoners of war. And socialist propaganda is spreading amongst the soldiers and amongst people at home in Russia. So this little cartoon from 1915, a Russian officer asked Tsar Nicholas, why do we have these fortifications? So this big wall, these cannons. Surely the Germans are not going to get this far. And the Tsar said, but what about when our own army returns? So the Tsar has lost the support of the army. He's about to make some big mistakes. So here we have the military failures we just discussed. And now Nicholas is about to make two very serious political decisions that are going to harm his reputation and lead to revolution. Just before we get onto those mistakes, the economic impact was severe. A third of able-bodied men were at war, which means there are significantly less people working at home to produce food and other goods. By 1916, food prices were 4 times higher than they were before war, and strikes for higher wages became more common. And this leads us to Nicholas's errors, and this is the last thing we're going to talk about today. So his first error was that he made himself commander of the Russian army, replacing someone who was popular and experienced, and that is the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, which is my dream name. So Nicholas is like, no, I'm going to replace this guy, even though I have no military training, and it will mean I'm leaving Petrograd behind, and there's no Duma in power to take over. Alexandra was hyping him up. She's like, no, babe, this is fantastic. You're proving yourself that you're the autocrat without whom Russia cannot exist. So I like that they're just throwing around the word autocrat as if it's a good thing. So some of the failures of this problem is that, thank you for the laugh emoji, is that Nicholas literally abandons Petrograd so that he can command the troops, but he's also symbolically abandoning the people. And now that he is in charge of this war, any defeats, any casualties are not going to be, oh, well, the army's bad. It's going to be, well, the Tsar is bad. So it leads to a lack of confidence in the Tsar. Here is a quote. We can probably read it at our own time. But essentially, this man warned the Tsar that by going to making himself the commander, this was a decision that threatened Russia, the Tsar himself, and his dynasty. And we'll see that this, again, was correct. The Tsar had all of these warnings. They all proved to be correct. Partly that's because of history. We don't have the warnings which, said things that didn't come true, but we can see that the Tsar was warned. His second big mistake was leaving Alexandra in charge of the government. And essentially, just as he was now leading an army despite having no military experience, the Tsarina was now leading a country without having any political experience. Yes, and we're going to lead into the rah-rah Rasputin scandal. So she was encouraged by her boyfriend, Rasputin, and she liked autocracy, so she was happy to be in charge. Her role as leader of the Russian government was problematic because of her political experience. The fact that she was German, and that's who they were fighting, a lot of people were very suspicious about this. And because she basically just implemented whatever Rasputin told her to. Here is a little love letter from Alexander to Rasputin. And now, what are the problems with Rasputin? Alexandra didn't like the Duma, so she wasn't going to ask them to step in. Her reputation was damaged, especially because she was seen as a special friend of Rasputin. And she would support people who were friends of Rasputin, and she showed significant political favoritism. So, for instance, during this time, she hired 4 prime ministers, basically because they were people Rasputin knew. So nepotism was rife. Rasputin himself was seen as a symbol of decay in the Russian rule. Globally, people were mocking, within the country, people were mocking the fact that this is who is making the decisions. Here we have a really good quote from Pears. The Russian ministers were selected by an ignorant, blind, hysterical women based on how loyal they were to an ignorant, fanatical, debauched adventurer. Here it was this pitiful spectacle. So Rasputin and Alexandra in charge directly contributes to the perception that the royal family and the government were in political shambles. We remember these pictures. Here we have Rasputin looming over the Tsar and his wife. And just finally, in the Fourth Duma, there was a little attempt at not quite revolution, but close to, where in the Fourth Duma, a group of moderates formed a progressive bloc, and they were disappointed in World War I, and they tried to pressure the government into adopting a series of reforms that would make people respect and like Russia again. However, and one of them even, accused the government of stupidity or treason and said that things should be overthrown, but they were unsuccessful. So that's where we're going to end today. But just to recap, Tsar Nicholas ends the 1905 revolution with the October Manifesto promising more rights for the Russian people, but then immediately goes back on these promises with the fundamental state laws, where he says, no, I'm in charge. He then doesn't allow the Dumas to work effectively. There's a period of peace because of Peter Stolypin and his economic reforms, as well as his use of execution and repressive methods, spying, torturing any revolutionaries. But then after he's assassinated, we start to see tension in Russia again, which is heightened by the Leonard Goldfields massacre, in which people are murdered for exercising their political beliefs, which leads in turn to a series of strikes. This revolutionary sentiment is then exacerbated by Russia's involvement in World War I. Despite the fact that they were initially supportive of Russia's place in the war, ultimately the failings of the Russian army prove that this war is not going to be good for Russia. Economically, they're suffering even more than they were beforehand. The soldiers are abandoning the war effort. Many were literally just leaving, quitting, and others were preferring to be captured. The Tsar is losing support from the people, and so he decides the best decision to fix this is to take over as commander of the army, whilst also leading his politically inexperienced wife in charge of Russia. So we're going to end it there, and I'll make a separate video about 1917, just because we had the February and October Revolution in that year, and so I thought that probably deserved its own video. And then I'll do another one for area of study 2. Are there any questions before we go? Thank you both for staying in. Thanks, Olivia. I'll end the recording now. Good, Eva. I was even recapping myself. I was like, oh, I forgot all of these things, so I think it's good. But yeah, hopefully this helped. There's also the one up on Teams from the HTAV things. But you guys can go. Have a lovely afternoon and a nice weekend. Let me end the recording.